The silence of departure. Elena Morozova had always been a quiet child, but silence took on a new meaning the day her mother signed away her future. The transaction was dressed in fine words: opportunity, a better life, security beyond these cold streets. But Elena knew what it truly was: a sale. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a woman with dreams of her own. She was a commodity. Her mother, Natalia, avoided her gaze when she handed over the papers to the agency. The ink dried, sealing Elena's fate. There was no protest, no dramatic cry, only stillness. If she screamed, it would change nothing. If she begged, her mother would still close her heart. And so Elena swallowed her words, locking them in a place deeper than her soul. The ship to America loomed at the dock, iron gray against the churning waters. Elena stood in her worn coat, a small trunk by her side, as the cold wind whipped her hair into her face. The other women chattered nervously, some giggling with false excitement, others weeping into their handkerchiefs. Elena said nothing. Her silence was a wall. If no words escaped, then no one could see how much she bled inside. Her destination was a man named Ivan Morozov, a wealthy merchant who had left Russia years ago. The irony stung. They shared a surname, but there was no kinship between them, only a contract. He had paid generously, her mother had accepted, and Elena was the currency exchanged. When the ship docked in New York, Elena was met by Ivan himself. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from stern lines. His eyes were cool, appraising her as one might inspect a parcel to ensure it had not been damaged in transit. He extended his hand, firm but formal. "Elena," he said, his voice low, deliberate. She inclined her head, took his hand briefly, and followed without a word. The carriage ride to his estate was long, the silence between them heavy. Ivan did not seem bothered. He spoke occasionally about the estate, about the land he had purchased, about the workers he employed. Elena listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing countryside. She gave no reply, not out of defiance, but because words felt foreign on her tongue. The house itself was imposing, a grand structure of stone and wood, standing proud against the winds that swept across the valley. Servants hurried to take her trunk, their eyes flicking curiously at the new bride who did not smile, did not chatter, did not even lower her gaze in shyness. Elena simply moved with measured grace, her silence both armor and burden. That night, as they sat across from one another at the long dining table, Ivan studied her. "You are very quiet," he remarked, not unkindly, but with curiosity. Elena lifted her eyes to his and allowed a faint nod. She could have said, "I was sold. I have no words left." But she only sipped her wine and returned to her stillness. Ivan was not a cruel man. His tone lacked the sharpness of command, and he made no demands of her that night. Instead, he seemed puzzled, as though expecting her to fill the space with small talk or nervous gratitude. When she did not, he allowed the silence to stand, though his eyes lingered on her with a strange fascination. In the days that followed, Elena learned the rhythms of the household. Ivan was busy with trade and correspondence, often leaving early and returning late. He provided her with fine clothes, respectable duties, and a seat at his side in public. Yet beneath the appearance of a marriage, there was no intimacy. He did not reach for her hand, did not seek her company in idle hours. It was as if her silence had built an invisible wall between them. But someone noticed. Mikhail Petrov, Ivan's childhood friend and trusted confidant, came often to the estate. Unlike Ivan, his manner was warm, his laughter quick, his eyes alive with mischief. From the first meeting, Mikhail's gaze lingered on Elena, not with cold assessment, but with something softer, curiosity tinged with sorrow. He caught her once in the garden, standing among the roses. The evening sun lit her hair, and though her lips remained closed, her eyes carried depths that words could never touch. Mikhail bowed slightly. "You must think us strangers," he said gently. "But I hope, in time, you will find comfort here." Elena inclined her head, offering nothing more. Yet something flickered in her chest, a recognition that someone had spoken not at her, but to her. That night, as she lay in the vast bed of the estate, Elena pressed her fingers against her lips. Still no words escaped, but the seed of conflict had been planted. Her silence, once a shield, was drawing the attention of two men in very different ways. One, her husband, saw mystery. The other, his closest friend, saw longing. And Elena herself began to wonder which gaze would break her silence first. The weight of silence. The days in Ivan's household unfurled with predictable rhythm. Morning began with the rustle of servants, the faint aroma of bread baking, and the distant sound of Ivan's voice issuing instructions for his trade. By afternoon, the estate lay quiet, heavy with the absence of conversation. For Elena, each hour was marked not by activity, but by the stillness she carried like a cloak. Ivan noticed, though he never pressed. He watched her at meals, his gaze searching for hints of a hidden world behind her composed face. When she did not offer them, he filled the silence with words about shipments, contracts, and markets. He was a man who understood figures and bargains, but not the language of hearts. Elena, though seated across from him, might as well have been oceans away. At first, Ivan assumed time would soften her reserve. Perhaps she would grow accustomed to him. Perhaps gratitude would replace fear. Yet as the weeks passed, her silence did not yield. She moved through the house like a shadow, graceful, obedient, but unreachable. And something in that distance began to unsettle him. Mikhail, however, approached her differently. He did not demand her words, but lingered in her presence with patience. In the garden, he would remark on the roses blooming late or the birds migrating overhead. Sometimes she would tilt her head in acknowledgement. Other times her lips curved faintly, a ghost of a smile. To Mikhail, those tiny gestures felt like revelations. "Elena," he said one afternoon, handing her a fallen blossom, "you speak without speaking." Her eyes flickered toward him, uncertain, but she accepted the flower. For a moment, the world felt less heavy. The contrast between the two men became impossible to ignore. Ivan respected her space, but his efforts were transactional. He gave her comfort, but not companionship. Mikhail, with his warmth, offered no wealth or security, yet he provided something rarer: attention. In his presence, Elena felt seen, even if she never voiced her feelings. The conflict was subtle at first, but it deepened with each encounter. When Mikhail visited, her silence shifted, less rigid, less defensive. She listened more intently, her eyes softening, her posture relaxing. Ivan noticed this, though he did not comment. He merely tightened his grip on his glass at dinner, his knuckles pale, as Mikhail laughed too easily in Elena's direction. The house itself began to echo with unspoken tension. Servants whispered about the unusual quietness of their mistress and the unusual brightness she carried when a master's friend was near. Elena, oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge it, continued to move like a figure in two worlds, a wife in duty, a woman in waiting. One evening, as autumn winds swept through the valley, Ivan returned earlier than expected. He found Elena in the drawing room, seated by the fire with Mikhail. They were not touching, not even leaning close, but the warmth in their shared silence was undeniable. Elena's eyes glowed in the firelight, softer than Ivan had ever seen them in his presence. He cleared his throat, and both looked up. Mikhail rose at once, bowing slightly. "I was keeping your wife company, Ivan. The evenings grow long, and silence can be heavy." The words were innocent, but Ivan heard more than courtesy. He heard a challenge. That night, as they prepared for bed, Ivan studied Elena's profile in the dim candlelight. "Do you prefer his company to mine?" he asked, his voice measured. Elena turned her gaze to him, calm but unreadable. She shook her head slowly, a gesture that carried neither denial nor confession. Her silence, once protective, now seemed like defiance. Ivan lay awake long after she closed her eyes. For the first time, he recognized the fragility of the bond between them. He had purchased a wife, but he had not won a heart. And in the shadow of his friendship with Mikhail, he felt the first sting of rivalry. Elena, though still wordless, sensed the shifting currents. Her heart was not yet claimed, but it leaned toward the one who saw her humanity rather than her role. She did not intend betrayal, yet desire was a seed already planted. The question was not if it would grow, but when it would bloom. As autumn deepened, the estate braced for winter's arrival. Fires burned brighter, nights grew colder, and in the silence of those long evenings, choices pressed closer. Elena stood at the edge of something she could neither name nor escape. She was bound to a man by contract, yet tethered by longing to another. And for the first time, her silence felt less like survival and more like the beginning of sin. The fracture. Winter descended swiftly, blanketing the estate in a hush that mirrored Elena's own silence. Snow pressed against the windows, muffling every sound, and the hearths burned constantly to ward off the biting cold. Within that quiet fortress, the threads binding husband, wife, and friend began to twist into something dangerous. Ivan grew more restless with each passing week. His trade suffered from storms delaying shipments, and his patience, already thin, wore thinner still. At dinner he spoke more sharply, his voice weighted with irritation. Elena listened, nodded when expected, and answered nothing. To him it felt like indifference. To her, it was the only language she trusted not to betray her true feelings. Mikhail continued to visit, though less openly. He sensed Ivan's suspicion, yet could not stay away. He claimed his presence was for business, for counsel, for the bond of childhood friendship. But in truth, it was Elena who drew him back. Her stillness called to him, not as a void, but as a refuge. In her quiet, he saw strength where others saw absence. One evening, with snowstorm winds rattling the shutters, Ivan was summoned to town on urgent business. He left after supper, his cloak heavy with frost, his horse disappearing into the darkness. Elena retired early, wrapping herself in a shawl near the fire. The silence of the house pressed closer than ever, suffocating in its intensity. A knock at the door startled her. Mikhail entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Forgive me," he said, voice low. "I came to see if you were well. The storm is merciless." She hesitated, then gestured toward the fire. He sat, their chairs angled toward one another, the flames painting their faces in gold and shadow. For a long moment neither spoke. Elena's hands trembled faintly in her lap, but her eyes held his. "You live like a ghost here," Mikhail said softly. "I cannot bear it." Elena's throat tightened. Words fought to rise, but fear anchored them. She shook her head, as if silence itself were safer than the truth. Mikhail leaned forward, his expression torn between restraint and longing. "I see you, Elena. You are not invisible to me." Something inside her cracked. A breath escaped, half sob, half sigh, and with it the dam of silence threatened to break. For months she had carried loneliness like a second skin, and now someone dared to peel it back. Her fingers, almost without thought, brushed against his hand. The touch was enough. Mikhail clasped her hand, his warmth steady, his grip reverent. He did not pull her close, not yet, but the nearness between them pulsed like a confession. The fire roared louder, as if bearing witness to a sin not yet spoken. "Say the word," he whispered, "and I will stop. But if you do not—" Her lips parted, trembling. No sound emerged, yet her silence itself became permission. When he leaned in, she did not turn away. His mouth met hers gently at first, a question more than a claim. Then her response deepened it. Years of longing condensed into a single kiss. The room swam with heat and guilt. In his arms, Elena felt alive for the first time since leaving Russia. This was no transaction, no arrangement. It was choice, reckless, and dangerous. For one night, her stillness shattered into passion. When dawn bled pale across the snow, she woke in his embrace. Reality returned with brutal clarity. She pulled away, clutching her shawl, shame knotting in her chest. Mikhail reached for her, but she shook her head fiercely. "This cannot continue," she whispered at last, the first word she had spoken in weeks. Her voice, though fragile, carried the weight of truth. Mikhail froze, stunned by the sound. His eyes softened, but he nodded. "I would rather live with one word from you than a lifetime of silence," he murmured. Elena turned away, tears slipping down her cheeks. She knew she had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. Ivan's suspicion would sharpen. Mikhail's devotion would grow bolder. Her stillness, once her shield, had betrayed her. As the storm outside calmed, the greater storm gathered within those walls. Elena had spoken, but the silence left behind was louder than ever. The breaking of silence. The thaw of winter came late that year. Snow lingered in heavy drifts along the valley roads, melting in slow rivulets that carved paths through the earth. Inside the Morozov estate, the atmosphere was colder still. Elena's fleeting transgression with Mikhail hung in the air, unspoken yet palpable, a secret etched into the walls themselves. Ivan felt it most keenly. His wife's eyes avoided his with increasing intensity, and his friends' visits carried a tension no warmth could disguise. Though he could not yet prove betrayal, suspicion hardened within him like ice. He was a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, contracts signed, goods delivered, debts collected. Yet here, in the sanctuary of his home, control eluded him. One evening, he returned unexpectedly from town. The lamps in the drawing room flickered low, shadows stretching across the carpet. Elena sat by the fire, her shawl around her shoulders, a book unopened in her lap. She lifted her gaze as he entered, her stillness as perfect as ever, yet something in her expression betrayed unease. "Where's Mikhail?" Ivan asked without preamble. Her fingers tightened on the fabric. "Not here," she whispered. The sound of her voice startled him more than her words. For weeks, she had offered him nothing but silence. Now, even in that brief utterance, he heard layers: fear, guilt, defiance. His chest tightened. "Elena," he said, stepping closer, "do you think me blind?" Her lips parted, but no answer came. The silence that had once intrigued him now felt like a wall too high to climb. He wanted truth, not shadows. That night, Ivan did not press further. But in the days that followed, he watched her with sharpened eyes, tracing every glance, every movement. And when Mikhail returned under the guise of business, Ivan's fury reached its breaking point. The confrontation came swiftly. In the great hall, Ivan faced his friend, his voice trembling not with rage, but with betrayal. "You came into my house, Mikhail, my house, and you laid claim to what was mine." Mikhail did not deny it. His eyes, steady and sorrowful, shifted briefly toward Elena. "She is not a possession, Ivan. She is a woman. You never saw her, only her silence." Elena stood frozen, her heart a drum in her chest. Two men, bound since childhood, now broken apart because of her. Yet the greater fracture lay within herself, between duty and desire, contract and choice. Ivan turned to her, his face etched with grief. "Tell me the truth, Elena. Speak it to me, once, if you have ever thought me worthy of a word." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. She could have hidden behind silence again, could have let their friendship collapse under suspicion alone. But something inside her shifted. The woman who had been sold, who had endured in stillness, found a voice. "Yes," she said, her voice raw. "I betrayed you. Not out of malice, but because I was unseen. I was never your wife, Ivan. I was only your purchase. And in Mikhail's eyes, I was something more." The admission cut through the hall like a blade. Ivan staggered back, the weight of her words striking harder than any denial ever could. Mikhail moved forward as if to shield her, but she raised her hand, stopping him. "This is not about choosing one man over another," she continued, her voice steadier now. "It is about choosing myself." The silence that followed was heavier than any she had ever endured. Ivan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching and unclenching. At last, he turned away, shoulders bowed under the weight of betrayal and loss. "You will have your freedom," he said hoarsely. "Both of you. But do not ask me to forgive." Mikhail's eyes widened, but Elena shook her head. She did not reach for him. Instead, she stepped forward, placing the shawl over her shoulders as though ready to face the world beyond the estate's walls. "I do not seek forgiveness," she said quietly. "Only the chance to live without silence." With that, she walked past them both, her footsteps echoing across the stone floor. Neither man followed. Outside, the last of the snow was melting, the air sharp with the scent of thawing earth. Elena paused at the gate, breathing deeply, her chest rising with something unfamiliar, relief. The path ahead was uncertain, marked by loneliness and hardship. It was hers. For the first time, she was not a daughter sold, not a wife confined, not a lover hidden. She was simply Elena, and in the echo of her silence, she discovered the sound of freedom.